34. I examined the dead city as our raft drifted down the gaunt canal, and did not like the way its outline suggested awful things that one may witness in diseased dreaming. One could not believe that such a place was inhabited, and yet there came from some place deep within a sound of muffled and monotonous drumming, deliberate and persistent. I could see, beyond the filthy fog that hovered over the decaying towers of the metropolis, the expiring orb of day sinking in the darkening sky. Our raft was sailing slowly, and yet it disturbed me to see Bobby standing boldly near its edge, holding on to nothing but the enormous grimoire that he had found in an antique shop somewhere in the necrotic megalopolis. We had almost reached the city's end, when I beheld the stone bridge ahead of us that spanned the gaunt canal. I thought that the dark figure who stood at the centre of the bridge was waving at us. But as our craft neared her, I saw that she was gesturing to the risen moon, and it disturbed me, as we approached the bridge, to see Bobby raise one hand and imitate the dark woman's motion. I peeked to where her face should have been, but all I could discern was undulating shadow beneath the length of rich red hair. And then she was blocked out by the rotting stone with which the antediluvian bridge had been erected. The city was behind us, and gradually our craft drifted more slowly still, until it floated to an outcropping of rocks and stopped. I marvelled at how my young friend hopped nonchalantly onto those slippery rocks and climbed their little height to solid ground. Cautiously I rose to a standing position on the gently bobbing raft and gingerly stepped onto one flat rock, and as I balanced myself on the stony surface, the raft behind me moved away, re-entering the black canal and drifting from us down the oily water. "I don't care for this weird trick you've proposed, Bobby," I informed him. "You told me that we were going to visit a haunt of spectral dream, such as I experienced during last night's slumber. Thus far, this is nothing like my delicious nightmare. Why you've brought that cumbersome tome is quite beyond me." It was then that the little imp turned to me and smiled as he had never smiled before, and he opened the heavy book so that its sheets of parchment were illuminated by beams of moonlight. I could not decipher the words that had been etched thereon in minute script, and to stare at it oppressed me with headache and dizziness. I had of late been plagued with an unaccustomed ocular trouble which prevented me from reading fine print, and as I peered at the page, I experienced a renewed tugging of nerves and facial muscles. "Look here, Howard," he squeaked. "This is an elaborate description of the way to our desired destination, a diagram of language. It's easily deciphered. Come on, old man, follow me." He scampered ahead of me, almost skipping, and I limped after him along the way that led down a dark, half-wooded heath where boulders wore patches of phosphorescent moss. I followed the young creature, who was impelled by some obscure sense of quest, until we came to a dark and seemingly familiar woodland, into which we walked. Time passed, and at last we came to a miasmic swamp, which seemed to excite my friend. Pointing to an alien-featured tree across the fetid quagmire, he yelled, "There! We need to stand before that tree!" He studied the squalid water, and then, to my astonishment, walked onto it, laughing at my yelp of caution. When I saw that he did not sink into the depths, I approached the dank surface, and saw the path of large flat stones on which my friend was walking. "Are you coming, Howard?" he called, and so I timidly stepped onto one flat rock and held out my arms in an attempt to balance myself as I followed Bobby across the water. Yet the rocks, large as they were slippery with slime, and just as I had almost reached the other side, I lost my foothold and fell into thick water. Bobby, standing on grassy ground, shook his head as if I were some pathetic clown, and then he set down his book and offered me his hands, which I took as he pulled me out of the swamp. How strange that other hands beneath the surface, phantasmal and determined, seemed to try to hold on to my ankles and drag me to the nadir of foul water. Bobby helped me to the solid ground, on which I dripped. "You're a damn mess," he sadly informed me, and then he seemed to completely forget my existence as he turned to the unfamiliar tree and touched a hand to one of the black spheres that was attached to its low branch. Why on earth did he begin to hum to that queer object? And why did his humming sound so unnatural? How curiously he bent to that black sphere and touched it with his mouth. I began to step toward him, and foolishly trod upon his monstrous book, the binding of which was warm and wet. Bending to pick it up, I was appalled to see that the hide that served as binding seemed to be perspiring, which caused a cry of disgust to escape my mouth. My noise caught Bobby's attention, and he filtered to me with drowsy motion, and relieved me of my burden. "We're almost there now," he pronounced as he chewed upon the black flesh of the sphere into which he had eaten. I did not like the alteration of his intonation, how it was laced with a kind of buzzing articulation. Nor did I like the way his mouth had widened when he smiled. "I have devoured knowledge, and can show you your habitat of vision. Follow me." Although wearied of this game of follow the leader, I held my tongue and moved my feet, my legs weighed down by the heavy fabric of my soggy suit. Eventually we emerged from the woods upon a tableland of moss-grown rock lit by faint moonlight, and something about the place did indeed seem strangely familiar. Even more recognizable were the rusty tracks of a street railway, which we followed until we came upon a yellow vestibule car, such as I had discovered in my unfathomable dream. It was untenanted, as in my dream, and we cautiously boarded it. Bobby, before me, had opened the tome, and was reading from it in his peculiar buzzing drone, and the snatches of formulae that he uttered aloud were so frightful that I begged him to stop. He turned to me, and revealed the monstrous malformation of his face, which was now a mere white cone, tapering to one blood-red tentacle. My mouth was frozen with terror, and I could not understand why his clothes were as drenched as my own, or why the heavy book was in my grasp. Feeling faint, I staggered forward, toward the archway in which the other figure stumbled until its visage touched my own. Howling bestially, I plunged into and through the yielding door of glass, the shards of which ripped my atrocious visage from me. Blind and idiotic, I stomped on the floor of our temporary globe, the blasphemous book pressed against my breast, as I raised my facelessness to the cold and primal stars. 35. She escaped the hidden, silent place of old woodland, and saw the sunset over the city's towers. The crimson face of the setting sun bathed her eyes with beauty, and soft wind wafting over the canal came to her, moved into her long red hair, and frolicked with the folds of her yellow gown. From the woods behind her she heard a faint buzzing that reminded her of something bad, and so she fled to the stone bridge and began to cross over the canal, stopping midway so as to watch the raft that floated toward her on the water. Of the two figures on the raft, the teenage boy standing near the craft's edge ignored her as he studied the heavy book he held. But the other fellow was staring at her with such a helpless expression that she raised her hand to wave at him and smile. How strange that her motion seemed to increase his worry, and this so annoyed her that she did not turn to watch the raft emerge from under the other side of the bridge, but continued her way toward the sunset city. She stopped on her way to study the faceless statue that stood a little ways from the bridge, and wondered at the book of stone it held in basalt hands. How curious were the symbols etched into what passed as the leaves of the statue's book, and how her fingers tingled as she ran them over those etched characters as a blind woman would in reading Braille. Finally, she turned from the curious stone and advanced towards the city, running her still tingling fingers against the softness of her silken gown. She entered the city and walked its oddly narrow cobblestone streets, until coming to the extraordinary edifice that was a funerary chapel, whose facade was decorated with carvings of fantastic beings that could exist in dream alone. When she entered the place, she was surprised to encounter the smoke of incense, for the place seemed absolutely deserted. Pushing one door of scrolled wood, she entered the chapel chamber, where she found 7 stone coffins instead of pews. Upon each oblong box of stone reclined a sculptured figure so lifelike that one could imagine they were the slumbering dead, with hands pressed in prayer to some dread lord. She pressed her own cool hands together, and whispered words that she had remembered from some obscure book of myth, and it confused her how her language spilled from her as a mist that floated upward, to the roof of beams from which 6 skeletons swung from lengths of hempen rope. As she watched the subtle dance, the risen moon appeared behind one arched window, throwing her beams onto the things of bone, and casting their silhouettes above the altar-place. Wind hummed through crevices in the rotting walls, like some low moaning of lost souls. She watched the skeletal shadows on the wall, above the spreading sculpture of a tree, and when she stepped onto the altar-place, she marvelled that the fruit that hung from sculptured boughs was real. She plucked one pomegranate from its branch, and bit into its tart white pulp, and then she laughed to see the pale worm whose flesh she had almost nibbled. Carefully she chomped again into the flesh of fruit, as the lengthy maggot fell onto her palm and moved with shaping until it resembled one of the curious symbols that she had observed on the fore page of a book of stone. Lifting her hand, she smoothed the creature into her hair, and felt it fall onto the fabric of her neck, where it stretched itself into a fleshy rope that coiled around her and lifted her into the quivering air, to where the others hung. 36. I loved the ancient things, for in them I found a trace of some dim essence, beyond time and space, of the past which is more alive to me than this dull neoteric age that fancied itself so clever and original. And so I sought and found the olden city, whose legend had been whispered among devotees of dark things. I was not disappointed. It was almost impossible to believe that the place had ever been a modern sight, for its desolate towers and cobblestone lanes were the very epitome of dead eras. I was enchanted by one forlorn edifice that upon entering I discovered to be a kind of funeral chapel. I paused into its nave, where there were no aisles, but rather 7 coffins of stone. The ceiling was covered with a macabre fresco of 7 skeletons, engaged in a dance around a monstrous white worm. I walked on to the altar, where I found a large book bound in red leather. But when I opened the book I found that the script on its yellowed pages was too faint to be read. Turning the brittle leaves, I found a faded photograph tucked into the book, and I studied the image as well as I could, which seemed to be of some kind of faceless icon wrapped in a crimson robe. I shut the book and looked around, but could not locate the physical representation of the photographic image. Whistling a remembered hymn, I strode out of the building and continued my investigation of the cobblestone lanes, until I came upon what must once have been an antique shop, but was now obviously an abandoned ruin. There was no door, and the large window was fissured with age. Peering through the cracked pane, I was startled to see that the cramped room beyond it was still packed with fabulous items. Dim moonlight above me threw my shadow into a dusky corner of the room. At least I thought it was my shadow, although some trick of illusion made it fluctuate with movement, as if it were beckoning me to enter inside its confines. I crossed the threshold, and breathed in the tenuous ether of the silent room. I looked around at the objects from another time, and seemed transported through dimensions that, unlocking, pulled me into other years. The awful glow of the pale, pitying moon crept through window cracks, and in that strange light I sensed another realm press upon my mind, as if I had entered a fantasy of dream. I walked until I found the nameless icon carved from crimson wood, and it shocked me to realize that it was a representation of the photographed being I had beheld within the Church of Death. I could not fathom what it might represent, or why its countenance was veiled. I carried it with me as I continued my exploration of the room, and I laughed with delight when I found a kinetoscope with a winding handle, which rotated as I pressed my face against the viewing screen. What unearthly light began to bloom within the box, in which I beheld the flickering image of 6 gnomes who capered within a circle of squat stones. They danced like lunatic freaks, and banged the backs of their hands to those of their neighbours, and as their talons struck each other there was a play of sparks, which illuminated a figure in the background, a thing out of Poe, tall and lean, and wrapped in fabrics red as sunset flame. I watched as the figure raised one beckoning hand, as the sparks tapped against the glass through which I peered, the surface of which began to crack, as had the window of the dismal shop. I felt those sparks spill into my eyes as my hair stood up on end, and for a moment I was blinded by a blackness that seemed to pull me into it. I shut my burning eyes and pushed away from the machine, but as I steadied myself, the air around me altered, and the silence of the place was haunted by the faint beating of insistent drums, that was accompanied by another throbbing sound, as if I were surrounded by things that danced. And when I opened my eyes, I saw the beasts that moved in slanting moonbeams, the creatures of which I was the 7th. We twirled upon the haunted hill, in ghastly light, as the fixed mass that was our world disintegrated into a cloud of dust, upon which the strange Dark One exhaled, until we drifted into some unknown gulf of night. Finis.